He was having his shoes shined and stood still for the full 10 minutes of the exposure. So it was in the middle of the day, probably a busy street. There were plenty of people walking by, but they didn't stay still long enough for their image to remain on the plate. So a broken thermometer and a guy standing still to get his shoes shined, and we have this. So at the same time as Daguerre, Talbot was working in England on his own process of photography. This is a photograph of a window. So an easy way of getting photographs in those early days was pointing the camera directly at a light source. That way you're sure that light is going to hit the surface. And this one is reversed. It's a negative. So not strictly as representative as Daguerre's process, it's harder to read this image because we don't see in negative. But because Talbot was working on paper, he was able to do this. He took the negative image and put it on top of another sensitized piece of paper and exposed it to light. The light filtering through that paper and through the other image created a positive image. This was very important for photography going any further because now they could make copies of a photo. And Talbot also discovered the development of a latent image through a mistake. He was trying to reuse a piece of paper that failed. It was underexposed, there was no image on it, and he was washing it with a chemical solution, and the image he thought was gone forever appeared. So doing this on purpose, again, allowed his exposure times to decrease and use this in much shorter time periods. Okay, so we're still in the 1840s here. I don't want this to stay as a history of photography lecture. That's not what I want to go on about. But in that time, photography was a lot more sloppy and chaotic than it is now. Now it seems much more refined, and pretty much anyone can pick up a camera and take photos and have them look way more natural and representative than this photograph here. But a lot of important discoveries were made in that time, and a lot of the flaws that happened in that time were later used for artistic effect. One of the examples here, I'm going to skip to this photograph. This looks really damaged and messed up. It's a daguerreotype from sometime in the 1800s. I couldn't find an exact date for when. But if you see that blue area there, that's solarization. That's a partial reversal of the tone because of extreme overexposure. This was very easy for it to happen by accident. They hadn't quite figured out the exposure times, and it also occurs if light hits the film or the photo paper as it's being developed. Very easy to accidentally flip on a light switch in the darkroom. So I'm going to cut ahead to this, the exploitation of flaws. When things go wrong, it's important to be able to see those as an opportunity for expression. So that solarized image before, that one was just a kind of damaged thing, and they kept it anyway because that was all that came out. That was the result of that photograph, and they didn't really have the ability to do more, or time or resources or whatever. This is using that same concept. This is a photograph by Man Ray in the Surrealist period. The shadows and the highlights are getting reversed here. So Man Ray and Lee Miller, two Surrealist photographers working in the beginning of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, 1900s. And they also discovered solarization. So one day when working in the darkroom, the light came on when things were being developed, and this effect happened. Instead of seeing it as just something that had gone horribly wrong and they should start over, they decided to push this and see where it went. And they were able to create this. Multiple exposure is another thing that happened. Oh wait, these came out of order somehow. This is another one by Man Ray, also using the solarization technique. And it's most pronounced on the edges of her body, causing her to melt into her shadow. So this photograph here would not have been possible without making that mistake before. And this one was very much on purpose. Okay, going back to this one. Multiple exposures. It's pretty easy to accidentally expose a sheet of film more than once. And even in the 1800s, they started doing this on purpose. This is an example of spirit photography. Someone realized that when the images overlap, you get this strange ghost image on top. So to kind of exploit people who are more superstitious, they brought people into the studio and had them do spirit portraits. They were photographing the people with their dead relatives. So obviously now, it's like looking at this, it's a darkroom trick. And the photographers knew this, but the subjects didn't necessarily know this, so they ended up buying these portraits of them sitting with their dear departed whoever that was. So back then they were already kind of playing on this mistake and also people's unawareness of how that mistake could happen. Okay, long exposures. This is a photograph by Michael Wesley, and it was taken in 2001 to 2003. That is the amount of time the shutter was open for this photograph. So he's a modern photographer. This was taken at the Museum of Modern Art in New York as it was being remodeled. He positioned a bunch of cameras around the museum as it was being remodeled and had the shutters open the entire time. And people had done long exposures before, and you get the effects of like light trails, and when things move or change, you get a ghost image of them. So he just kind of pushed it as far as he could and had it open for about 3 years. I heard recently that he's working on a 10-year exposure. I don't think that one's done yet. So what you see in the middle there was like scaffolding and other building materials that for some of the exposure they were there, for some of it wasn't. And those white streaks in the sky that's the sun. So he really used the artifacts of a long exposure as a way of expressing himself there. And this one is another from Surrealist days, Hans Bellmer. This is a hand-colored photograph. So it was a black and white photograph, painted. And at the time that he did this, color photography, I believe color photography was possible when this one was made. But even if it wasn't for this particular one, he continued to do this after color photography was available. So instead of using color film, he decided to paint the print, because he decided that the artifact of using paint on a print was was more what he wanted than using color.